So hi, welcome everyone. Second talk in this extra series. Am I all right? So today's talk is by Prem Krishnamurthy. Prem is multi-talented Renaissance man. I think main background and work is in communication design. So Prem runs a design studio, which I think goes through any number of names. I'm not sure what the most recent one is. He'll tell us in a minute, I'm sure. But Prem is also a writer and a curator, and also a teacher. And we've caught him. The reason this talk is early is because he's in the middle of teaching another session at Hamburg right now. So we're quite lucky to get him on a Wednesday. He's been very, very kind to accommodate us within his schedule. So I think the reason why I've invited Prem particularly is I got to know Prem through some project spaces, gallery spaces that he was running in New York, K exclamation and then P exclamation. And it struck me when I went to these spaces that as well as obviously the exhibitions and the discourse and the kind of written material around those exhibitions, what the spaces were involved in as much was setting up a kind of provisional community of shared interests, common interests, and in a way that allowed lots of different groups of people to overlap with one another in a way that I didn't usually see and I don't usually see with art galleries. So of course the openings were very important, but in a way it was the intersection of different constituencies or different sort of sectors through the different exhibitions, which sort of struck me as kind of a result or a consequence of the programming and exhibition strategy that Prem had. And so that caught my initial attention. And then more recently, as well as kind of working on being the curator for the Carnegie Triennial for 2022, which has been deferred, Prem was through he's now in Berlin, was setting up a group exhibition, Polymorph, which then got nixed because of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And in response to that, this was of course like a common thing in the art space that, you know, all our plans kind of got screwed basically because of the pandemic and the restrictions on social interaction. But what Prem did in response to that partly was to set up a set of online platforms called Sunday Sessions, in which he again seemed to invite different groups of people, different constituencies, to come together to kind of think through and actually also just be together through the kind of initially very, very difficult stage of the lockdown and the readjustments that we all had to make. And then that kind of transformed into something which seemed to kind of work in other terms. But doing similar sort of work, I thought, to what the, not the direct ambition of the exhibition spaces was, but a similar kind of recomposition of a kind of experimental compositions of communities, I think. So I very much wanted to invite Prem to this series because it seemed to me that he's a kind of very good example for, I don't know if Prem ever calls himself as an artist, but in terms of being a practitioner who works in the art field, but also outside of the art field. And another point of interest for me is that kind of shuttling in and out of, you know, specific art sector that we occupy through the programs at Goldsmiths. But Prem's practice seemed to me an example to adapt a set of concerns, a kind of set of long abiding interests and ambitions, and adapt them through practical material and social demands that lockdown and COVID have made on us all. So I thought it might be of interest, I think it will be of interest for Prem to kind of talk us through some of the range of practices and range of, I don't know what to call them, outcomes or deliveries or presentations that he's done, and to kind of then think about what we need to adjust to through lockdown, and also now as we look to the aftermath of lockdown and an adjusted normality. So with that, I'll hand over to Prem. Are you there?
Great.
Hi. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Pale, for the introduction. No known you for a bunch of years and admired your work for even longer. And so it's really thrilling to be here. And thank you to everyone for coming today. You all look so beautiful. I can see these wonderful monochromatic squares that really give me a sense of the room. But no, seriously, thank you for everyone for coming. It's nice to have this context to explain my work in a different way. I think Suhail's invitation really gave me the chance to rethink how I talk about my work. And so I'll frame that a little bit more. But before we begin, I like to start any event that I'm speaking at with some sort of exercise or practice that brings people into their bodies, particularly in this moment of sitting in front of a screen and really encountering each other through only the senses of sight and sound, and maybe a little bit of touch in the chat. And so I'm going to play a short piece of audio for you. It's about 4 or 5 minutes. And as a background, it's from a fantastic interview between the psychologist and trauma specialist Resmaa Menakem, who is based in Minneapolis in the United States. And it's a conversation of him with Krista Tippett on her show On Being. And Menakem is interested in uncovering the connection between racism and trauma and how this is rooted in the body on a nearly cellular level. And I mean, I will just say, I think this podcast is one of the most powerful things I've listened to in a long time, and I highly recommend that you also give it a listen when you can. But for now, I'm just going to play a short segment in which Menakem has his listeners practice a different way to orient their bodies when they move into a room, when they enter a new room. And he's recommending this practice in particular for what he calls bodies of culture. But I also think that this exhortation to look around, to practice a sense of bodily safety and groundedness and listening is a relevant starting point for all of us as we enter into the unfamiliar territory of the next hour and a quarter. So let me play that. If somebody can just give me a kind of hello in the chat if you hear audio when I play this, okay? Let's try it.
In terms of a practice, it's a very simple practice. If you're listening to me right now, one of the things I want you to do is I want you to just to sit
it works
for a second.
Great.
I want you just to stare straight ahead. Just look straight ahead. And as looking straight ahead, just notice what is actually landed and what is actually still kind of in the air. All you're doing is just kind of noticing what's happening. Noticing how much you dislike my voice. Noticing how much you dislike, some of the things that Krista said. Just notice those pieces. Now what I want you to do is look over your left shoulder and use your neck and your hips. So turn and look over your shoulder. And then come back to center. And now look up and look down. Come back to center. And now look over your right shoulder using your neck and your hips. The reason why you use your neck and your hips is I want you to engage engage some parts of the vagus. And then now come forward. And now just be quiet and notice what's different. What'd you notice?
Well, I was kind of aware that I was half thinking about what was going to come next, but I don't know. I felt more settled.
More settled.
I felt, and there was also a feeling of there's kind of a feeling of comfort.
Yeah. So one of the things about the animal part of the body is that even though me and you are in this room, this nice place, there's a part of the body, right, that's saying, yeah, but what else is going to happen?
Yeah.
right? And the reason why, especially when I'm working with bodies of culture, one of the first things I have them do is orient, just like orient to the room, right? Not orient in a mystical way, but actually literally, because many times the bodies of culture are waiting for danger, even though you know nothing's behind you, right? Letting the body know it actually helps some pieces. Now, if you get reps in that, not just do it one time or just when I tell you to, right? What you may notice is that you may have a little bit more room for literally for other things to happen that can't happen when the constriction is like that.
You know, that makes sense too, in terms of how trauma is in the eternal present. It's not, you're not remembering it, it's reliving itself.
That's right.
And you're like getting, you know, just for that minute, you're actually settling in the real present.
That's right. And then the body goes, oh, you mean that's there too?
Right.
And then your body starts to do this thing where you go, well, I don't want to do that no more. And then if you can get another, there's a thing called the reticular activation, right? That it's the thing where you go buy a car and you say, man, this is a beautiful car. Ain't nobody else got a car like this. There's this color. And then you drive off the lot, you go down 5 blocks, you're like, damn, that's the same. Damn, everybody got this car, right? It was always there, but now because your brain has said this is important, it makes it right.
You see it everywhere.
You see it everywhere. That's why the reps are so important,
right?
Because when you get the reps in, if you get the reps in around race,
everywhere.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because if you get, that's why the reps around race is so important. Is that because as you get more reps in about it, all of a sudden other things start to become important that weren't important, because now your brain is saying, oh, I need to read that. Oh, I need to pay attention to that. Oh, I need to track her body. Oh, I need to understand that. Oh, I need to ask questions about, right? That, and now those things become attracted to you, which creates more angst, which forces you to transform.
Okay, thanks. So the link to that whole podcast is in the chat. So thank you, Camilla or Camille, for putting that in there. And I also put the just that practice, but I highly recommend listening to the entire unedited podcast. It's almost 2 hours long, but it is absolutely worth listening to. So let me see if I can screen now. And okay. So it's kind of, I'm not actually seeing what you guys are seeing. Do you see a big yellow page right now?
Yes. Yep.
Wow, I can't hear anything. Did I lose you?
It's good.
Okay, so you can, okay, you did see a big full screen yellow thing. Great. Well, back to that. Thank you. A couple of quick introduction points. I mean, one thing is that I believe in transparency. I will fully admit that I made this presentation yesterday. I woke up early and I did it from scratch, and then I eventually called it a day. But what that means is, you know, I've always wanted to do a presentation in Google Slides. I come from a design background. I am still a designer. And so somehow, oftentimes we have the sense we need to use Pro Tools, not kind of commonly available tools. But I've always been fascinated by it. And so I wanted to just do it, make a presentation in Google Slides and see how it works. But as the kind of provisional title already might say, it's a prototype. And for sure, it has errors and things that will change. But it's the first time that I'm doing a presentation like this. It's the first time I'm formulating my practice in this way, and you are the first folks to hear it. So, you know, there is a method to my madness. As I go through, I think it'll become clear that I really do believe in general in prototyping ideas in public. I think that sometimes it's the fastest way to learn something new or unfamiliar. And so I'm also going to do something unorthodox. I mean, usually the cardinal rule of presentations is timing. Like if you've ever watched a TED Talk, there's something about syncing up your thoughts to the presentation and making it all seem really fluid and great. And but I'm going to do something different. I'm going to open the proverbial hood and just share my presentation with you now. I know we may have bandwidth issues, so I'm just going to put into the chat in a moment the actual Google Slides link. And that means that you can follow what I'm saying, but you can also look at it and you can poke around. And if you have any questions or comments or feedback, you can just put them directly into the document. You can tell me if something doesn't make sense, or if you'd like to hear more about something, or what you had for breakfast. And, that means that if there are any tech or bandwidth problems, or if you're not able to follow me, you can do that in the slides, and we can also cull from that for some questions at the end. And I mean, I'll say in general, I'm excited to be here because I'm eager to hear what you have to think. What you think about this. I mean, it is slightly strange that I only see monocolor squares. I don't actually get to see your faces. But I hope that you can feel your presence a little bit by seeing people in the doc and thinking. So here is the link. Maybe you can test it out and see if it works for you, and then I'll go back to sharing screen and click through it. But either on the Google Slides or directly in the doc, on the Jitsi or directly in the doc as you see fit. So can somebody just test that and tell me that they're able to get into that presentation?
Yeah, it's there. It works.
Cool. Okay, I'm seeing.
Would you like me to put it on the YouTube?
It's very strange. Silence is a new one that I have to learn. But I'll hope that, Snail, if you ever can't hear me and I'm not seeing the chat, just like text me or something, and I'll look up from what I'm doing. So let me try again to share my screen. Okay. So okay. So hopefully you're all seeing this kind of full screen-ish. So I'm going to start with, I just think, I usually have a whole bunch of things that I try to answer. And one of the things that's first is, they include why, how, what, for whom, but really the first question is by whom? Like, who am I giving this presentation? And so I put in this 88-word version of my bio. There are 30-word versions of my bio. There are 1,500-word versions of my bio. But Suhail very generously walked through some of the things that I've done. And, I have seen myself over the last 20 years as moving between different fields. I come out of design. I have a background. I did study art, specifically photography and graphic design, and moved from the United States, where I was raised and where I grew up, into Germany right after I graduated from college, and worked as a graphic designer there, and then moved back to New York in the early 2000s, started my first design studio, and a number of other things, helped to found a magazine, and then started an exhibition space in New York, and did a bunch of other things along the way. So this is kind of more focused on the stuff that I do now, which is between my graphic designing at Workshops, which is the studio that used to be known as Project Projects. Then I'm co-artistic directing the Front International 2022, which is the Cleveland Triennial of Contemporary Art, which was originally scheduled for 2021. Then I'm organizing this project called Commune, which is a research project about community that I'll talk a little bit more about with the Klasse Digitale Grafik in Hamburg. And then I've got to say that I won the National Design Award because, it's good for people to see things and be impressed. Sorry. I guess that's what happens with bios, especially if you're sending them to institutions or other things. But then we'll talk more about Present, which is one of my most recent things and a project that came out of COVID-19. and the last several months. So again, I've never given a talk quite like this. I've generally stayed away from chronological presentations of my work, but it actually seemed like a useful thing to try and put down some thoughts about some key things that I've done over the past 10, 11 years. This is obviously just a small sampling of things, but I started to realize that there are these strands connecting a lot of the work that I've done, and really they're around community. They're around how art and creative practice in general can create new kinds of community, and really specifically how they can create really diverse or communities made up of different kinds of people. I mean, my parents were immigrants to the US from India. I grew up as a kind of child of first generation immigrants, and I always felt some sense of being between worlds. And maybe that's also partially what informs my interest in communities that are actually made up of very, very different constituent parts. So I'm going to start with a project from 11 years ago, which is really a workshop that I taught in Germany, in Bremen. And I'm not going to say too much about it, except that in some ways, I think a lot of this thinking really crystallized there in this one workshop that was called Collective Collection. And Collective Collection, was basically, the setup was that I worked with a group of students for 1 week, and we had a space at the University of the Arts in Bremen, and I worked with them to think about what was a collective space. I mean, we started by, I sent them out into the city of Bremen, and they had to go and, almost like amateur anthropologists, find some sort of space of gathering or some sort of community space, and they had to do some research. They had to examine it, try to understand how it worked, who was part of it, talk with the people there, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, to be honest, my own methods back then were pretty crude. I never took any anthropology classes in my life. I wish I had. That would have made such a difference. But unfortunately, most of what I've learned at this point is by hook and crook, and by kind of doing it and talking to people much smarter than myself who have done that professionally and trying to learn from their methodologies. But so I sent the students out. They researched collective spaces and then thought about this empty gallery space in the university and what might be the uses it could serve, both for themselves and for other communities. And the thing that was really most interesting was that halfway through the week, when I myself got really uncertain as a teacher, I had been running this workshop with them, and I suddenly didn't know what they were going to do. We had been doing research, we'd been sharing things, I had been getting to know them, we had been doing these long 8 to 10 to 12-hour days together in this workshop, but I still didn't know what we were going to do and what was going to kind of emerge by Friday. And I got really nervous. And so I actually tried to shift the students to do something that I could understand more directly. And one of the students who, ironically or not ironically, ended up working for me later, ended up coming to New York and working with me, helping me set up my space in New York, helping me set up my space in Berlin. She actually, Judith Gertner, who is still my assistant, who is now on maternity leave, she actually was the student in the group who kind of revolted against that. She said, what do you mean? Why have you been talking about collective spaces all week, and suddenly you as a teacher are going to tell us what to do? And but it was great. It was exactly what needed to happen. And suddenly the students decided what they thought a space could do and how they wanted to use it. And so it kind of switched, and I became their assistant. I just helped them to typeset things and help them to arrange the room and help them to think about how they communicated it. But my role became much more like an assistant or a producer. And there was something that was amazing about that shift from moving from the position of authority, however kind of uncomfortable in that position, and then switching to being able to assist them. And I think that fluidity of roles between being a leader and being a kind of supporter is really, really important. The next kind of project that I want to talk about is a key design project for me, one that I still, feel very connected to amongst all the other work that I did while running projects, which became workshops. And this is actually a project that still exists and is ongoing. In Istanbul, there is an institution called SALT, which is a kind of cutting edge museum that is distributed across 3 buildings in Istanbul and Ankara. And it's actually a combination, its program is a combination of art, design, and research. And we were invited as a graphic design studio to come up with a branding system for this institution. But from the get-go, when we were asked to pitch it, we actually kind of inverted it and said, well, instead of a branding system that's just about communicating externally, what we would like to do is create an exhibition program within the identity of the institution. And what that would mean is that we would create a visual identity, but then periodically invite different designers from all over the world to change this and to actually kind of add their voice to it and take it from being simply a communication system to actually being something more like a conceptual exhibition space. And this is just this is the different typefaces and people that we had invited to make something from 2011 to 2017. And of course, it's still been going since then. So, there's always new kind of designers who were involved in it. And it did play the roles of a kind of more standard graphic design system, playing out across signage and printed material on the website. And there's a way in which these different identity typefaces become like a timestamp for different moments of the institution's activities. But most importantly, to me at least, it was the sense of creating a community even within something as specific as a branding system. So again, this next project that I wanted to share, and wait, I'm just trying to see, can somebody just say in the chat, I can see you? Because still, it's really weird to kind of do this and have literally no feedback. So just somebody be like, hey, yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
We can see the
That's
other
great.
two. We can see the other two. Yeah.
Oh, love it. Okay, this is actually warming my heart. Thank you. This is like, whoa, thanks. Okay. So now I'm blushing. Okay, so the next thing I want to show, which is probably a project I've never shown publicly in this kind of a context, but it seemed super relevant, is a project that was a special issue of Print magazine, which used to be sadly closed, but it was one of the oldest and most important graphic design magazines in America. And so they reinvented it with a new editor, and they decided that they would ask different design studios to each guest edit and design, or maybe I think it was actually to guest design an issue. And I think they came to Project Projects, the studio that I ran back then, and said to us, well, and we actually proposed them, we'd like to not only guest design it, we'd like to guest edit it. And we would like to actually take on the task of commissioning all the writing, all the photography and work, and really guest editing and designing and art directing it. And so what we ended up doing is I had been teaching with my former partner, Adam Michaels, at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, a couple of years before that, and we have been teaching a class around collaboration, where we actually modeled different scales of collaboration with the students. We had them work first on a project alone, then in groups of 2, then in groups of 4, and then as the whole class. And at each stage, we had the students reflexively kind of model back in critiques and conversations, not only what they had made, but how the working process was. And it actually taught me a lot about what things might work and what might not work in a kind of studio setting. And so anyways, but at the same time, I was really, maybe skeptical. There was something of skepticism in the idea of collaboration, because it was a term that had been overused by so many kind of corporate entities, and that I really had the sense it hid a lot of power dynamics. And so, we wanted to kind of explore this and see how could we do this in a magazine. And the way that we did it, the first thing we did was that we actually organized a roundtable at New York's Artist Space, which is a kind of venerable independent institution. And so we organized a kind of interdisciplinary roundtable where we brought all of these folks from design, but also art and fashion and other things, and critics and curators and practitioners into a room and had a kind of roundtable conversation that we then transcribed, and it ran throughout the whole magazine as this kind of interwoven thread. So the edited transcript became a kind of counterpoint to all these different articles, which were not exactly what you would expect for a graphic design magazine. I mean, they focused on people like Alison Knowles, the Fluxus artist, and her use of typography and automated poetry. It focused on groups like Group Material, who are still, you know, the politically active and engaged art collective in the 80s and 90s, who are still a touchstone for me. But it also focused on graphic design studios like Athletics, who worked in a collaborative manner. And I'm just going to read this, actually. This is like a little thing from the interview, and it's Angie Kiefer, who is a writer and artist, speaking here. And so Aaron, who was Aaron Kennedy, the editor of Print Magazine, says, but collaboration is not just people having dinner or a drink. It is, I think of it being about a task. And Angie says, is it really? Perhaps that's why it's difficult for me to talk about collaboration, because I can't think of anything that's truly possible to do as an individual. In art or cultural production, there's an economic imperative to operate as if you're an individual, because the evaluation of the product is based on an identity. Whereas in a commercial environment, the opposite is true. Products are not tied to individual producers. They're always produced by teams of people. And I mean, I'll say this kind of, that's just one little bit from the whole thing. I'll also say, if you're in the Google Slides, I think, yeah, I put a link to the publication. You can download that. The magazine went out of print business, unfortunately, but you can download a PDF of this whole special issue, and it has things about how Artist Space itself was designed and the kind of semi-conflictual, semi-collaborative process between architects and institution and graphic designer. Has had a profile of the late great Jonas Mekas. It had a fantastic essay by Rax Media Collective on the time of collaboration. And I'll just say, last thing I'll say about this, because again, I've never really talked about this in public, I don't think, is we also thought about the idea of cooperation or collaboration on the level of the structure of it. So each of the different articles had a different custom typeface or unreleased typeface by a type designer that was used for it. So there's also a real sense of it being a polyphonic magazine, one that did have a structure and had a kind of running thread of this conversation, but also that modeled in its form or in its structure some of the ideas we were interested in around collaboration. So this brings me to probably like one of the larger things that I'll talk about, which is P exclamation mark, also known as K period, which was the space that I ran in New York for 5 years. And, you know, I could give probably multiple talks just about this, so I'm not going to go into great depth, but I will say there is like a website that's pretty out of date, but it has a lot of the information about what we did there on Broome Street, and there's like a kind of, you know, there's a lot of writing around it. But this is where I also got to know Suhail. But it was, I started this in 2012 really because I saw there as being like a gap in New York in cultural production, in terms of there were the galleries and there were the museums and there were the nonprofit spaces, and there's a lot of overlap between those. But for me, I was really interested in rethinking some of those models and thinking about questions of display and how the framing of a thing really has an ideological power, and how we often don't think about that. And also, I wanted to bring a different set of practitioners to the fore who weren't being kind of shown, or practices that weren't being shown in New York in the same way at that time. Those included, you know, historical practitioners who were still working and living, but were multidisciplinary, like Brian O'Doherty, who, you know, coined the term the white cube, or Elaine Lustig Cohen, who has now passed away, but who was a great designer and artist and archivist, as well as people coming from other fields, in particular graphic design. And, you know, I'm not going to get too much into it, but trying to really think of it as a space, as Suhail already framed, where all of these different discourses and communities could come together. And, you know, part of it was that it saw itself as being extremely responsive. I started to use that word at some point in time, that the institution, instead of just having an institutional identity, both in the way that the space looked as a storefront on Broome Street in New York's Chinatown, changed very, very dramatically from exhibition to exhibition. And the space itself transformed architecturally, and to the point that sometimes people didn't even recognize it from one to a show to another. And in fact, as I kind of hinted at, we changed our name for a 6-month period. We were P exclamation, and then for 6 months, we changed our name to K period in order to do a series of fast-paced shows that kind of modeled or lived out like a Bildungsroman of a Lower East Side gallery, and that looked at financial systems in particular. And so it was like a performative gallery. And when we changed to K period, we changed our name, we changed our logo, we changed our website. And there were people who had been to the gallery before and came back to it and didn't know it was the same gallery. They thought that we had moved and it was something totally different. And this reflected in our press releases and our communications, which were always designed and written with the material in mind for a given show. And so, and you know, there are these logos that different artists or participants in the shows made. And, you know, in the space itself, as I said, it just transformed between show to show. I'm not going to go through all these because I think that this would take a long time, but you can see this was the first show we did. And in some ways, what it really modeled was, it was a show with, it was a show that already embedded 3 different ways of working, where with one of the artists, Carl Martens, I was like a classic curator. I curated a selection of works that he had made and helped to figure out how to display them. With one of the artists, Chauncey Hare, who was an artist who left the art world or the photography world to become an occupational therapist, and really like came to have an oppositional, adversarial relationship with the art world. Since he no longer allowed people to show his work, I almost worked like an exhibition designer, worked with books and materials that I could basically acquire, that I could buy online, and then created like a kind of exhibition display with a big mural and other things. And then finally, for the artist Christine Hill, I was almost like an agent for her work. Her work was around trading signs, hand-painted signs with different businesses in Chinatown, borrowing their signs and then designing signs for them that they could then display. And so actually, for the duration of this exhibition, I became her agent. We became her agent. We went around to every week to a different business in Chinatown and offered to swap signs with them. And then we would borrow their sign and design a new sign for them that they could show for the duration of the show or keep if they wanted to. Most of them kept the new signs that we had made for them. But it was also a way of reaching out to the people, the folks who were already there in the neighborhood that we had just moved into. And I'm not going to go through all these, but this is a show that curated with the artist Wong Kit Yi, also known as Ali Wong, which was called The Ceiling Should Be Green. In brief, we actually we hired a feng shui master whom she had worked with before to look at a short list of artists we had given him and tell him who were the good artists based on their birthdays and their places of birth. And he told us who were the good artists and where their work should go, as well as predictions about their work. And all I can say is it was 100% true. It showed that there are many, many kinds of knowledge to understand the world, and all of them are very valid. And I would also say within the Google Slides doc, each one of these images is a link. So if you click on it, it'll take you to the page on the P website with more images and information and all. This was a show with a collective known as How Do You Say Yam in African, which were a group of Black artists who had a very controversial relationship with the Whitney Biennial, in which they pulled out of that, but they made a work in response to the killing in Ferguson in 2014, in August 2014, and the subsequent uprising that was called The Way Black Machine. That was a 24-channel installation that looked at police responses and people's responses to social media. Very powerful work, and one that I'm still very proud to have at least been able to help give them a space to accomplish this project. Other projects by the artist Matthew Hale that thought about display and photography and historical knowledge in kind of wide-ranging ways. Or again, thinking about graphic designers like Karl Martens, who's now in his 80s, who has made a tremendous body of work as a graphic designer, but also as an artist since the 1950s, and but really kind of showcasing that in New York for the first time. Or these kind of more multivocal experimental exhibitions, such as The Stand, which I curated with Anthony Marcellini, that took a dystopic novel, Stephen King's The Stand, and tried to actually perform that within an exhibition in 2017, just after the election in 2016 in the US, trying to think about the political landscape. And I should say, The Stand, it's a kind of post-apocalyptic pandemic novel in which a super flu leaks out of a lab and kills 99.9% of the people on the earth. And so, I don't know, it's something that I was thinking a lot about a couple of months ago. And finally, our last show at P was an exhibition by the artist Celine Condorelli, who is based in London, and she is an amazing, multi-talented architect, designer, institution builder, friend, and she really thought about stripping away the history of P and using pieces of the gallery and its own like institutional memory in order to kind of create a space for exchange. And this last image of P is, for me, this sums up a lot of my work, because what's happening here is, in the exhibition that Celine Condorelli made, there were a series of conversations around the politics of display, the ideologies of exhibition design, and thinking about institutional formats with a group of people that were very wide-ranging and in a setting that changed our relation to each other, that changed the expectations of a social space. And I come back to this image often because I think, oh, this is like actually what I have wanted to do for a long time before. And it came together literally in the last 4 events that I did in P in 2017. Oh, and this is this funny. Oh yeah, this is this kind of, well, I'll just read it. It's funny. This unconventional vest, so this is like a Zagat's review, but made out of press responses to P over its years. And I wrote it literally on the morning that we closed the gallery. I wrote it and like sent out this email blast. I'm not going to read it out loud. Why don't you just take one moment and read it? I would like to think it's funny. If it's funny, say something in the chat. Or if it's not funny, tell me you hate it. Okay, now I feel really old because I don't know what X with like a D is. I think that's maybe a smiley in Norway, but I got to look that up on the internets. I feel old, but okay, thank you. So I'm going to speed it along. I'm going to try to be done by 10 minutes maximum. Suhail, is that okay?
Sorry, just go.
Okay,
Yeah, that's fine.
I want to leave time for questions. And hopefully, I don't think I can see them at the same time. Maybe some of you are putting questions or comments directly into the Google slides, which I would love. I would love your feedback, because this is just a process of, learning. You know what? I'm going to skip Picker right now because it'll take a whole nother set of explanations. It did take place in London. Maybe some of you even saw it. It was at Stanley Picker Gallery at Kingston University, London. It was probably one of my favorite projects I've done, but I've never talked about it in public either, which is a weird thing. But it involves Celine Condorelli as well as Elaine Lustig Cohen, the late great artist and artist and designer, and also was really about programming and bringing people together within a very highly authored space. Okay, now we're getting to the present, so that's good. So this is like, this talk was called Post Present, which I thought was maybe funny or punny, but really, as Suhail mentioned at the beginning, it was, you know, I was supposed to do an exhibition at the University of Connecticut called Polymorph, and it had been something I'd been working on for a very long time, and it involved designers and artists from all over the world. And then 2 weeks before, it was postponed indefinitely. I mean, I think now it's on the books for September. Let's see if that actually happens. And, you know, at first I was, of course, totally, you know, I was pretty broken up about it. But now there's another book. If you have a chance, there's a fantastic podcast by, I don't actually have the link here, but I'm going to write his name, Bessel van der Kolk on Being. There's a fantastic psychiatrist named Bessel van der Kolk who has also written a lot about trauma. I'm currently reading his book, The Body Keeps the Score. He had done a podcast on Krista Tippett's On Being that I listened to in January before COVID-19 hit Western Europe and the US. And it was about, something really resonated with me. He talked about how when you're confronted by stress or trauma, the body releases stress hormones. And if you don't do something with those hormones, then they turn inward and they turn destructive. And he talks about, in the wake of the hurricane in Puerto Rico, going there as an observer and realizing that the people who had the ability to go ahead and rebuild their homes, they suffered less traumatic stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, because they could do something with that stressed energy. And so I kind of took that to heart. So in mid-March, when my show was postponed and my trips to the US were all canceled and a lot of my work started getting moved around, I said, well, okay, I can either just like step back from things, or I can say, well, let me just try to take the thing that was meant to be a show and turn it into an event. And long story short, it became this kind of a 2-hour event that I meant to do as a one-off. But then at the end of that first Sunday, when I did this event that involved talks and karaoke and dancing and more, people said, and artists from all over the world, you know, whom I never could have brought together in real life. I never could have had the budget to do that. Well, when I did that, then all these people I didn't know said, you have to keep doing this. Like, this is something we need. We are currently physically isolated. And so I did it for 6 weeks every Sunday, which was somewhat exhausting, but also really thrilling, because I realized that it was actually had a purpose. It was bringing people together. And there is a whole archive of that. I'm misusing the word archive, but there's a whole, if you click on these links here, there's, I don't know, I've never watched it. There's documentation of all of them. I don't usually watch documentation after the fact. It freaks me out a little bit. But I think it was quite meaningful for people, or at least that's what I've heard. And these are just some screenshots showing, for example, Emily Smith, who is a designer and improviser, also my life partner. She had led and curated one that involved a lot of embodied exercises coming from her background in dance, but how you can rethink the frame of the screen. You know, there was a lot of Octavia Butler. A recurring segment throughout all of the sessions was the artist Connie Samaras, who has been seeding Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower for about 20 years. And so this is Shelley Strebe, who runs the Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop in California, talking about Octavia Butler. And that is Octavia Butler's predictions about 2020 from 25 years ago. Can you believe that? George Bermudez also brought in, through Connie Samaras, a psychologist who has been running social dreaming matrices, where people get together to move away from the idea of dream interpretation as being an individual activity, but rather think of it as a collective social activity. And I've just participated separately from Present in a couple of his dream matrices, which are really interesting. And there was a lot of dancing. Fun is definitely part of it. Oh, okay, so this is what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to play a 2.5-minute clip. Let's see if this works. If it does not work, then I would highly suggest that you just click on that link that's in the document and just watch it for 2.5 minutes, and then we come back. Okay? This is like a mashup of the first episode of the show, very crudely edited together, because I just learned how to edit again after 20 years of not doing it, but kind of shows a little bit of the flavor of it. Tell me, give me a heads up or a chat in the type if you can hear it or see it.
Yeah, I read it at the moment.
I'm lucky.
Oh wait, there's no sound.
Right.
You hear sound?
Bumpiness
Yeah.
in chat
You hear sound?
in the irregular.
in what's not already expected and familiar. Okay.
Excuse me, Prem. I heard what you were saying. You know nothing about my work.
My artwork up around, and I'm just kind of like going through archives. I made some new collages.
Learn from what you did and try to use that knowledge for the next step.
As new technologies transform our bodies and senses, how are they changing our models of community? How might art, design, curating, and other creative pursuits define themselves collectively in the future?
It's one big experiment to connect performance, performativity with design and communication and put it together.
I actually started drawing right now, sort of. I wanted to do like a weird loop thing.
Thinking maybe we should talk a bit more about Butler if people they're not familiar with Octavia Butler's work.
Stand up and just kind of move your body.
It's our archives. Information about conditions on Earth over hundreds of thousands.
I like the running subtitle in karaoke because I like the idea of running with time.
Both because of their subject matter and because of their format.
The timeline was a response to a crisis that we were all experiencing personally and individually.
Art making often represents poetry over persuasion, difference over didactics.
With the idea that the act of writing, that there are some kind of healing vibrations in the act of writing poems.
The project demonstrated that it's sometimes possible to party and pursue utopian goals at the same time.
It's bumpy.
Very bumpy.
This is a Missy one-time exclusive. Come on, is it worth it? Let me work it. I put my thing down, flip it and reverse it. It's your primitive plan yet. It's your primitive plan yet. If you got a big, let me search it to find out how hard I gotta work yet. It's your primitive plan yet. It's your primitive plan yet. Come on.
So, seemed like that kind of worked. That was really awkward because I couldn't hear anything, but I had to assume you could. Okay, well, I'm cool. And again, all of the episodes, I have no idea how it is to watch one of those as opposed to being part of one of those. Frankly, I'm not that interested in spectatorship. I'm more interested in the idea of playing in a thing. But yeah, but I will just end very quickly. I'm sorry, I'm going to go another 2 minutes. But last thing is this project Commune that I'm doing with Hamburg's Klasse Digitale Grafik, which is like a small master's and bachelor's program focused on experimental interface design. But it really, in some ways, I might just be a little euphoric because I've been talking now for 40 minutes and I've had a lot of tea. But I have to say, it feels like the culmination of about 20 years of thinking, where it's about the protocols of community and how can communities built out of different people, communities based on difference, actually come together. But what are the visible and invisible protocols of them? What are the structures of them? And how can you make those structures visible and those power dynamics and actually be aware of them in some way? And so every week until July 1, we are holding a kind of conversation between two people who have never met before in this experimental Jitsi room, this kind of experimental customized Jitsi room that continues to, programmed by the students, that continues to evolve from week to week. And so actually today, well, yeah, right after this, I think at 4 o'clock your time, I will be doing the next conversation, which is with the American artist and the architect and researcher Laura Kurgan. And so that's today at 5 o'clock, and they'll be coming together in this Jitsi room. Unfortunately, one of the things that I'm not so psyched about, but it's because of the bandwidth limitations, which is what we're experiencing now, they're actually running this Jitsi on their own server, but because of CPU and bandwidth limitations, there can only be about 20 folks in that room and have it not totally crash. And so it's very limited. I don't like limited events. I like events that are free and that anybody can come to. But what we can say is that on the page commune.hfk.net, you can watch it. And actually, if you are into Twitch, if you join the Twitch page, then you can also add comments and things. And we're going to try to figure out a protocol where they can relay those comments back to me and back to the room. It's a prototype. We're learning every time we go, but they'll be going every Wednesday until July 1. So I want to do a quick coda. I'm sorry, Suhail. I'm really a long-winded guy right now, but I can also stay for 5 or 10 extra minutes if needed. I'm just going to very quickly give you my coda, which is, this is a diagram that I actually only found about a year ago, amazingly enough, even though it's 50 years old. I guess that sometimes takes you that long. But it's by Charles and Ray Eames, the famous designers, and it's from their exhibition, What is Design, from 1969. In brief, it's a diagram in which they outline that the kind of project that the best design projects are those that represent the true overlap between the area of interest and concern of the design office, the area of interest and genuine interest from the client, and the area of concern of society as a whole. Now, many of you, all of you, I guess, are fine artists, or however you want to call it, and may think, oh, this is not relevant to me because there's not a client. I'm an artist, and so it's a different thing. But I actually think that this diagram is applicable to nearly any creative pursuit and beyond, because of course, as we know, there are clients in the art world. They're just called gallerists, or they're called museums, or they're called curators. They're the people who are commissioning things. And of course, maybe within the way we read an artwork and its relevance, we give more weight to the author's interest, which is, here corresponds with the area of interest, the design office, and its societal interest. But that client interest is there as well. And it's really important that we think about how we modulate these to actually think about the kind of creative practice we want to be producing in the years to come. So yesterday when I was writing this talk and kind of putting together this thing, before I did, I myself started to kind of put some notes down, and it actually came to some new thoughts. And I will say, Suhail told me that it was fine to be ambitious. For the last 20 years or so, being a graphic designer, you often kind of keep quiet and stay in your place because in a way, you often think as a graphic designer, it's not your job to have an opinion, it's your job to get something done. And I think in 2020, I've decided that I'm going to start having an opinion again. And so I'm going to I was going to live type these because I thought it would be really fun. But since I have no more time, I'm just going to live copy in to the last pages of the thing a set of thoughts that I just had, literally yesterday, but that also are somehow, they come out of, I found a notebook from 20 years ago. A notebook that I wrote 20 years ago in a hotel room while in a motel while driving cross country. And I found some things that seemed relevant. And so I'm going to, sorry, I just took a screenshot. I thought it was cool that there are people in here. So I'm going to try to, did that work? See, my cool thing I wanted to do of let's live copy it in. Oh man. Okay, well, I wanted to live copy in some notes that would just kind of summarize. Oh yeah, there you go. And maybe this can stay up and then you can ask me what the hell I mean by this. I mean, because of course, these may be very, these are almost like the maxims that I've decided that are what I think about my own creative practice, but also how others might think about their creative practice. So I'm going to leave these on screen and then, yeah. Oh, actually, they're out of order too. So there you go. I wanted this one first. Okay, that's it for now. Sorry I went so long, but thank you for your patience. Maybe I will come out of Oh, okay. I'll add a plus to question. Wait, where is that? Oh, to queue a question. Got it. All right, let me stop sharing. And let me.
So firstly, well, thank you so much for the huge amount of work in your presentation. It was quite impressive just to kind of go through that, and to think that you did that in the last few days. But also, I think just for the kind of courage of trying something out with us, because you're saying it's the first time you presented using this kind of low end app, and also new content for you. From my perspective, it worked really well. I'm going to ask you just two questions. One sort of more to do with the content that you have presented, and the second one will be about what's next. So I was quite struck in the presentation about, it comes up specifically about in the quote from Angie Kiefer about not having an identity, or not acting as an individual, and how in the art system the expectation is that you essentially have to brand yourself as an individual through your practice and maintain that identity. And I'm quite struck by how your practice as a whole, and the many people you've been involved with, and the many areas that you touch on and play with, I think in some ways, but engage with as well. It kind of goes all over the place. So it's very what academically you might call multidisciplinary, but it seems very hybrid. It's very multiple, and it's very, very open. And I was kind of wondering, I guess in a way, how deliberate that is on your part, or whether you're kind of constantly improvising according to whatever you think you need to do next, and whoever around you seems the person that you want to engage with for kind of your own development, but also development of the various kind of spaces, exhibition formats, presentation formats you've been involved with.
Cool. Do you want to ask both questions, or are you going to ask just that, and then should I answer that first?
I guess I'll wait. I'll save the second one because it's also quite a big one. I guess my rider to this one would be what intrigues me and kind of compels me around your practice is your flitting in and out of the art space, and in a way, what does the because the audience, I mean, like this is for some art programs which kind of very much geared towards professional art sector. In a way, what affordance or what allowance or what capacities the art space gives you that you don't find in the other spaces, but also what limitations it kind of presents to you as you kind of do this, moving in and out and sort of somewhat unidentifiable but pretty consistent engagement. That's it.
Great. Well, no, those are good questions, obviously. Okay, so let me think. The first one, well, yeah, it was striking reading that quote by Angie and thinking that she really hit the nail on the head in some ways, in many ways. And I'm lucky to have known Angie for more than 20 years. So I can't say that I haven't been influenced by that thinking. Well, I guess what I'll say is that in terms of the many things that I've done, I think there is both a deliberateness and a total serendipity. I mean, one of the things that is both great and maddening as a graphic designer is that as a graphic designer, you are responsive. You are in some ways, you are always a mediator between different worlds, between some sort of specialized body of knowledge and trying to communicate that to other folks. That's why graphic designers exist. In its best cases, what it means is that you as a graphic designer get to encounter new ideas and kind of new ways of thinking, and you research things and you learn so much. I mean, I think that some of the most famous graphic designers I can think of from the 20th century, particularly some who designed a lot of science exhibitions and other things, will talk about in their writings or in their interviews how much they loved really getting into the research with other experts. And I can say, for example, like, how did I come to know group material? The honest truth is I came to know group material because there was a book that Projects co-edited and designed around the Matrix Berkeley program's exhibition program from the late 1970s. And while I'd heard of group material, but didn't really know their work. And in fact, at that time, there wasn't yet a book published on their work. And so going through these exhibition archives, I found the original material from the AIDS timeline that they did at Berkeley Art Museum, I think in 87 or 88. And so, it's like, and then, so being a graphic designer means that you encounter all of these things and then you can choose to synthesize them or not. I mean, but I do think, my friend David Reinford from the practice Dexter Sinister, he has sometimes, and ORG, he has sometimes talked about himself as a synthesizer, which I think is very funny and cute, and he has a great penchant for early electronic music, so it makes sense. But it is that I think that, but let me put it another way. And so there's something that's just, find myself constantly, in my best moments, I'm in dialogue with lots of different people in many different scales. And I'm trying to ask them questions, and I'm trying to take what I learned from that and synthesize it in some ways. Or synthesizing might not even be the right word. I'm just trying to let it all exist in this kind of dialogic space where there are different opportunities. But the other part of it that I can say, and this is something about the art space, and, again, one of these maybe overly large arguments I might make, depending on when you reach me, is, there are lots of conceptions of art that are not very tied to the idea of individual genius or sole authorship. There are many conceptions of art in many historical moments that see the artist much more as a conduit, see the artist much more as an individual who perhaps is in touch with other currents and other flows that are happening. And so by manifesting this work in some sort of physical form, it is not the individual act of genius. It rather is kind of collecting, harvesting, manifesting things that might already exist in the world. And you just happen to be the conduit for that. And I think that is absolutely how graphic design practice is often seen, and maybe also curatorial practice. But I'd like to offer that I think that artistic practice might be a lot less conflicted and a lot more fun and useful, but useful is not even the right word. I just think it might be more powerful, actually, if we were able to move away from the ego-driven idea of what do I want to do versus what is it that is to be done. Now, I guess that this maybe dovetails into your second question about flitting in and out of the art space. To be totally frank, I did study art as an undergraduate, and complete disclosure, these days I think that vulnerability and transparency are the only real way. I spent many years, and I probably still spend time wondering about whether I should have been an artist, could have been an artist. I could have been a contender. I didn't have the confidence. I didn't have the economic means or the background, and I definitely just didn't feel the sense of being allowed to be an artist. And so in many ways, I decided to be a graphic designer because it seemed like a way to reconcile my creative impulses and my love of typography and language in particular with something that would be practical, professional, that could support me, all of these things. But in retrospect now, 20 years after that kind of pivot point, I actually feel quite happy about that, because I think that being a graphic designer has taught me a whole different set of skills in terms of looking at the world, talking to people, listening to people. It's given me exposure to other ideas. And now what I think about the art world is that, of course, I love a lot of art. I see a lot of art. There are lots of great people in the art world. I think there are fun conversations. So there's a lot that I get out of the art space, and I do still appreciate it. On the other hand, I think the art world, the art space is very, very convention bound. It is extremely conformance based. I mean, people really, it's really hard to do things in the art space that aren't either absolutely conforming to a set of norms that are pre-existing, or the opposite kind of adolescent response, which is reacting in an extremely kind of public and intentionally provocative way just to get a response. And so, and I mean, I would, in my terminology, I often talk about things that are smooth and things that are jagged, and bumpiness being in between. And I'm interested for sure in bumpiness, in the thing that is both, it's not just trying to be reactive. It's not just trying to get a rise out of somebody and like piss them off, but it's also kind of thinking about why rules exist and how they might be different.
Okay. I'm not going to put my say follow up directly, but I will. I think just that very last point about why rules exist and how they can be different, and to take up the point you made slightly before that about what is it that needs to be done as the kind of imperative of the practice, which gives you this bumpy zigzagging around. If you don't mind me being a bit confessional about a conversation we had in preparation for the talk, I think last week when we checked in to set this up, you said that I was kind of asking how things had gone through the lockdown, where you were now, because the sessions on Sundays had sort of were kind of concluding what was next, and also in reference to the anti-racist protests and riots in the States particularly, but internationally too. You'd said that you'd kind of actually this period had given you an idea of what to do for the next 20 years. I hope you don't mind me mentioning that. And I was wondering because part of the kind of demand or the imperative around the series is how we individually, but also collectively and working from art, respond to the kind of limited, the historical limitations or the historical expectations of how we work, and also what's expected of us, into a new configuration, and how to have a more just situation after COVID. I was wondering if you could just, as again, in a way, as an example, maybe not speaking for everyone, but for yourself, like speak about what you'd come to thinking about the current situation in terms of what to do next with your practice, both around lockdown, the consequences of it, and also the anti-racism protests, which I think everyone is preoccupied with.
Right. Well, thank you. It's true. I sometimes make very bold claims in conversation, which is frankly like a strategy I developed 20 years ago when I realized that if you say really absurd things like, I now know what I'm going to do for the next 20 years, which is of course total BS because I don't even know what I'm going to do in 4 weeks. But it kind of holds you to a standard, and once you say a thing in public, you suddenly have to really confront it, and you can always disagree with later, but at least you've made a position. So I'm actually going to do this. I'm going to actually.
You can't just say that. That's an option. Or I don't want to talk about it as a private conversation.
No. What I'm actually. No, what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to just, I don't know if do you see my screen again?
Yes.
Or no?
Yeah.
Do you see something?
Yeah.
Oh, wait. Let me do. What I'm just going to briefly, okay, I'm going to share this page explanation, which I literally wrote down yesterday, but it's kind of my best stab at what I'm trying to do next. And, we don't have a lot of time. I'm not going to go through all this, but let's just say what I realized literally in the last couple of weeks and months is that perhaps my argument is that art and creative practice construed more generally actually what it can do is create communities, but it can create specific kinds of communities. It can create communities of difference rather than communities that are all about sameness or conformity. I think, let me just say very clearly, the reason why I'm invested in the art space and why I think it's an interesting space to be in is because artists have a cultural position that they can leverage. Artists have a culture where they are allowed to think big. They're allowed to think outside of disciplinary boundaries. They're allowed to kind of think outside of professional qualifications. And this license, this incredible privilege and license, which is given to artists for centuries of, I'm going to call it brainwashing, centuries of kind of things that have taught us that the artist is a genius, is a tremendous position and a tremendous platform from which to do something. So, you know, my basic argument is that art and creative practice create communities in some ways. They create new communities, and I could get into this in more detail later, but let's just say that's my kind of argument. And I've been talking for about not quite a year, like more than 6 months, about these 3 principles that I'm trying to write a book about at some point in time, but they're bumpiness, juxtaposition, and generosity. They are kind of 3 strategies that I think I have recognized in my own approach to creative practice, but that I actually think can be useful to artists and designers and other people. And in brief, bumpiness, which I've talked a lot more about and published more about, is this idea of in a world where so many things are smooth, making things rougher with a texture and a self-reflexivity that makes people aware of the frame and aware of the way that our knowledge is mediated is really important. And juxtaposition being thinking about difference and thinking about how, rather than sameness, the different elements can coexist in a space and inform each other mutually. And generosity being about trying to model kind of ethical systems that are mutual as well, but that are reciprocal and not unidirectional, that are not, obviously if they're reciprocal, they're not unidirectional. But let's just say I'm working a little bit more on how to think about those. And I think like these 7 maxims, you know, they are, for me, I realized I literally culled some of them out of this note from my notebook 20 years ago, but they also, to me, are a way of practicing that I think actually, for me, points a way forward for what I think artistic or creative practice could be, and how it could do so in a way that both keeps the kind of best things about some aspect of art making, which is that I think there is a total value to individuality. I mean, I grew up in a household of South Asian immigrants where individuality is maybe not as culturally lionized as within a kind of European or North American framework. But that being said, I think there's something really valuable about the idea of individual self-realization, just to a point and in a certain way, and not through a consumerist mode, but rather through a kind of reflective mode, et cetera, et cetera. And so I do think that for the next 20 years, let's say, or maybe at least the next couple of years, I think it's for me to try to figure out how to both share the tools that I have learned over the last 20 years that I think can be useful for other people. I think it's also to bring people together. I mean, I do think that I've often, been in the situation of thinking, if I were in an Octavia Butler novel, if I were in Parable of the Sower and it were the end of the world, what would be the skill that I could bring to a group? And I think that for better or for worse, the skill I can bring is to try to bring different people together and to try and model some of the ways in which those groups those communities could interact with each other. And when I say that, that's not just on a practical level. That is where art is useful. I mean, we've all had the experience that it's far more interesting. Oh, you can't see the screen. Sorry. Okay. It's far more interesting and useful. Okay. Some people said that they can. I think it's far more interesting and useful to, for example, watch a movie with another person and discuss it with them. I mean, it's not useful to see it on your own. Both of those things are useful, but I always find discussing a thing is very, very, very useful. And I'm just going to say one more thing, which sounds a little strange, but it's a hunch I had a couple weeks ago, and then I'll shut up. It's that I realized that, okay, so in the way that people describe the experience of, let's say, of meditation or of mindfulness, or also of things like extreme sports or doing psychedelic drugs or focusing or looking at an artwork for an hour. I remember a gentleman who, a dealer who used to work with Warhol in the 60s, telling me how in the 60s he would go to the Met and he would sit at lunch for an hour and look at a painting, the same painting every day. And so there's something in the way that people describe those experiences. They often describe those experiences as being about a falling away of the self or a losing of the ego, a kind of sense of, but a sense of kind of porosity where the self opens up to all of these other things in the world, whether other people or other beings or other objects. And on the other end of on the seemingly other end of the spectrum, you have the experience of being, for me, let's say, in an art opening with a bunch of people I love, like a bunch of people I really want to talk to, and you're having a conversation and there are ideas flowing around and it's going back and forth, and you don't know where an idea starts and begins, and it doesn't matter who authored it. And suddenly you have the sense of also a kind of porosity and a relation to other people, other beings in a very different way. And what's interesting to me is that these two things that seem to be diametrically opposed modes, one being extremely individual, one being extremely highly collective, actually may have a similar result in terms of one's understanding of oneself within the world at large.
I think I had two, but I'll just ask one. On your maxims, I mean, and sorry, this won't be as much a question as it will be like maybe a way to try and open up the point that I'm interested in, was your third point about keeping things simple. And I think this is really interesting as a kind of, something as a way of framing what your process is in terms of producing. But I think it would be interesting to maybe like expand a bit on this, in the sense that like, so I actually did a little Skillshare as well on graphic design for people in the left a couple of weeks ago, and this was a thing that I kind of came back to as well. And the more I think about it, like, you know, you can really go into a lot of depth on what simplicity means and what its relationship is to kind of a very additive way of working in a sense. So like it's kind of like and I think it relates a lot to the other point that you make about improvisation requiring structure. So in a sense, it feels like keeping it simple is not like a thing of like avoiding complexity. And I think we need complexity, and we need to be able to work with complexity in the kind of context that we're making work now and thinking and talking about political issues and social issues. But I think it's a kind of way of gaining an access point to the complexity of that, which isn't immediately overwhelmed, which is kind of a really interesting, like a really interesting dimension of having a maximum of simplicity. So I don't know, like if you have any thoughts on that, basically. I mean,
Sure.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for the question. I think you're absolutely right. And of course, these maxims are version like 1.0, so they should change. Well, I mean, yeah, for sure. I think that what I'm interested in saying there is, you know, when I used to write press releases for my space in New York, I had a rule that everything I wrote had to be understandable to my sister. And what I mean by that kind of metric was just that, you know, my sister is an intelligent person, but she doesn't know, she's educated. She doesn't know anything about that much about art. But that it should be, I think that it's a question of like, whenever one uses language, vocabulary, whether formal, textual, otherwise, one should just think about why, like, complexity is a thing that arises. Complexity is a thing that is part of the world. And that one shouldn't over complexify for the sake of being obfuscating, for the sake of shutting people out, and that you should actually try to say the thing you're saying in the way that is kind of going to be understandable. And I think that it's not about some sort of modernist idea of like simplifying, because it doesn't also believe in any kind of universal there. But I think that in some ways it's also meant as a corollary to the next point, which is like, but remember to include the whole world, which I maybe more mean as I'm interested in things that are both simple, but also are not over specialized. They're not like only about a single topic. Like if I think about artworks, for example, I'm interested in things that are personally that aren't just about one very bounded, specialized, professional piece of knowledge, but that actually allow themselves to open up to be all of the different things that they could be. And I think that in a maker doing that and allowing that kind of openness and complexity to arise and emerge, it actually invites other people in and gives them more access points. Okay. Other questions? Jeff?
There's two more.
Yeah,
Aaron, and then Jeff.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much for the talk and presentation. I really appreciate it. I wanted to ask about the community. Like you're speaking a lot about this aspects of like creating communities, and maybe what I wanted to ask was like about the kind of their like timeline of those communities, or how do you maybe approach it in your practice? The thing of like, you know, there's a project in certain city, or you open a gallery space and then you move away to another country and you do something else, and you know, now it's just like project-based kind of art practice is very like dispersed, but that's also like way more connected around the globe. So is there like, do you have a way to, or how do you maybe feel about it? Like that on the one hand, we are like much more connected through internet, and on the other hand, there's no like, it seems like the communities are, they have like shorter lifespan or something like this, or like the space, it's more dispersed when this happens. And maybe this relates to the point too of your maxims about the public art, and then also question of what is public now. Sorry if it's messy.
Yeah. So Prem, can I suggest? I know you've got to go quite soon. Can I suggest we take Jesse's question as well?
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Combine and answer.
Yeah.
I'll remember Aaron's if we need to come back to it.
Great.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Hi. Thanks for a great talk. So I guess it's kind of perhaps related to the question before, but I was wondering specifically about your transitions from the page, but then particularly from the exhibition space to the kind of online live forum, the Jitsi or whatever. And I was just wondering about your early thoughts, having kind of been, I guess, maybe particularly prototyping that space recently, about how that changes the kind of relationship between performer or kind of artwork and audience or community. Because for me, it feels like, yeah, it's changed a lot. And I just wondered what your thoughts are, particularly on this, working in this like online chat room space that's become very popular recently, and whether you think you might continue to work in this format, and what you might take from these experiences maybe into real time physical spaces.
Great. Okay, let me try to answer both of those questions. Great, both really great ones. Okay, so, well, I'll start with Jesse with your question and work backwards. I think that Yeah, I mean, it's been a really interesting transition. I mean, I think that I think it absolutely changes the relationship, not only of performers to audience, but of us to each other in lots of ways. I mean, one point I'll make is that particularly through this project with Hamburg, the talk that's starting in 45 minutes, that is, really like acknowledging that every interface has a totally different way it models kind of people's relations, or at least a very slightly different one. And so, I'm going to tomorrow. So apart from the really top level thing, which is that these interfaces, they have cut off certain cues that we have. I mean, we're limited in right now, we're really just using sound, for example, even though we have a little bit of sight and we have a tiny bit of touch in the chat. But that's not to say that they're not embodied. They all involve our body. It's just that we're not thinking about it. And so I'm really interested, and we're not able to read the kind of physical cues or the even other somatic cues, the smell of people in a room. So it does change it. And so it really does make visuality, for example, extremely important. But an interesting fact is that although Zoom fatigue is well documented, a lot of people who have who have different kind of learning disabilities actually can have a better experience on Zoom because there are fewer kind of distractions. And so I think that that's really interesting. I think there's like a kind of way in which access might shift through it. And I also think for sure, like it's given me personally access to see people and have, close relations with people whom I never would have done that with if I were in the real world. I've met more people over the last 3 months than I usually meet in my life. And I feel like my relationships with particular people have deepened in really meaningful ways through that. And so, and even just the fact, I'll say, like, in a room, you can maybe only really see 20 people, but in a Zoom room, you can potentially see 50 faces and read everybody's kind of facial cues. And so in some ways, I think it's going to start to change how we relate to people in general. And I absolutely think that it will continue in my work. It has to, because now it's changed how I think about travel. It's changed how I think about distance. But it's also changed how I think about intimacy. And I think that that will kind of continue in the world at some level. Though, of course, we also have the major question of access. Who is it who can access, who has a high enough high-speed connection, can access these things in broadband? Those bring up all other kinds of questions. Which I think comes to the first question about community and timelines and, kind of what do you do with shorter time spans of community? I think that's a real problem and a question, as you bring up. I mean, I think that, for example, Present worked because it was a weekly thing for 6 weeks. And, by the end, there were really people who came every single week, people who later said to me, they marked their time during COVID through this. And, if I'd had more stamina, maybe I would have just continued. I would have kept doing them every week. I think at some point it was like both a physical and an emotional kind of impossibility, just out of exhaustion of putting together this thing every single week. That was very ambitious. But I do think that, ultimately communities have different lifespans, but they are about rituals, and they are about shared rituals that emerge over time. And so it's something I'm really thinking about. I mean, P in New York worked because it existed for 5 years and regularly programmed during that time. And so I have to think about how timescales change and what's possible. But I also think that the other thing that can happen is, the big question for me is that in an era such as ours, physical presence and access become more and more the province of the elite. And, to actually physically see somebody, I think will become an even more rare thing, and will really have to do with these extremes of kind of income and privilege. Whereas this kind of medium space of being able to access people online in different ways will become, I think, much more a norm for certain kinds of people, for sure for artists who are working kind of internationally or not just at the local level. But I think the main danger there is that how do you make sure that you're not only encountering people who are already like you? How can you actually encounter people who are different from you and be challenged in that way, and all of the associated discomfort and learning that comes out of it? And so I think that those are the questions that we're going to need to ask about these particular media moving forward. I see there's another question from Pavel, but I do think, I'm sorry, Pavel, I think I actually do need to get to my own event since now my students are waiting for me. Is there a way, Pavel, maybe you can put your question even, as I said, you can comment directly in the document too. I will take a moment and look afterwards later tonight when I'm done at any comments. So, and you have access to it now. I don't know, it's going to be there. So maybe you can put your question in there, and I'm happy to respond, or if you put your email in there, I'll kind of do some Google magic and get back to you.
Yeah, no, I'd recommend that. The great thing about Prem is that he never stops working. So
I'm working on it.
He's actually prepared to do that. But we should let you go to your next thing. I'm going to put in the chat box the link again to your next talk. I'll certainly be looking at it. So Prem, look, just to finish, thank you for talk. For me, it was like really encouraging to kind of hear what you have done, but also just encouraging to sort of see the dynamism of your practice and kind of like your final comments as well. I think all kind of embody the kind of supportive, how the talk can be supportive right now for everyone is kind of thinking about what to do with their practices. So I think leading by example in a kind of non-authoritarian way. It's been a really great talk for us. Thank you.